Welcome. I'm Janice Ellig, CEO and founder of Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search through our longstanding commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you for joining me today for our webinar series with Michele Wucker, an international best-selling author of her 2016 book, The Gray Rhino, a metaphor she coined to describe obvious, probable, and highly impactful risks. In her book, Michele developed a versatile framework for analyzing and improving responses to looming risks and to challenge decision makers to act decisively. In 2021, she published a sequel, You Are What You Risk, which explores the sometimes surprising factors that influence how individuals, organizations, and countries perceive and deal with their gray rhinos. In addition to her literary recognition, Michele draws on more than 3 decades of global experience in financial, media, sovereign risk analysis, and think tank management. Michele founded the Chicago-based strategic advisory firm, Gray Rhino Company, to help drive effective actions instead of the all too common risk of box ticking, or as we also say, kicking the can down the road. During the next 60 minutes, we will delve into the very probable, obvious gray rhino risks facing all of us each day. And I will take questions via the chat box. And if we don't answer them, we will answer by email after the program. So Michele, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. And
thank you for such a warm welcome.
And writing this incredible book. For me, it was a page turner. I could not put it down because I saw all the obvious risks in front of me, and you were giving me all these examples in your book. And I loved your signed inscription to me was, may you never get run over by a gray rhino. So I have my antenna up to make sure that I don't. But let's start, and I see your books behind you, the 2 that you've written. Let's start with, first of all, how did you come up with the title for Gray Rhino?
Well, I was really wanting to answer the question of how come some people see a big scary thing coming at them and do something about it, and other people don't. And it came out of my work with writing about Argentina and then about Greece. You know, the Argentina saw a huge debt crisis coming and didn't deal with it, and the cost ended up being huge. And Greece also had a crisis, but they got together with their creditors and came up with an agreement. And I wanted to know what made the difference, but I get that not everybody geeks out on sovereign credit spreads the way I do. And I wanted to talk about it in an accessible way, because I felt that the question was just so important and so relevant for business strategy and policy and other things. So I was in my office talking to a friend, a senior M&A corporate lawyer. And as I was talking, describing big, scary, dangerous thing coming at you, the rhino with the horn popped into my head. And so then he made a sort of a black swan joke. He says, oh, you can call it a black rhino. And I thought, wait a minute, I went to the zoo when I was a kid and there actually is such a thing, but isn't there a white rhino? Let me go to Wikipedia and check. And that's when I realized all rhinos are gray. The black ones aren't black, the white ones aren't white. And it was a great reminder of how vulnerable we are to getting trampled by obvious things, even though we think that we're paying attention to obvious things.
So let's start with your career as a journalist, reporting on financial crises, from debt in other countries, to leading teams in media and think tanks, and to becoming a well-established author. Now running your own firm, Gray Rhino Company. So you're advising organizations and policymakers, right? So describe this career path and how this has really helped you now to be a great advisor to these organizations.
Well, you know, it's funny, sometimes people still call me a journalist, even though it's been probably at least 20 years since I thought of myself as one. It's a great way to start your career because you learn to talk to all kinds of people. I'm an introvert, and so it was great to have this persona that made it easier to talk to people when I was really shy. And it you know, makes you ask hard questions. It makes you question whether what you're writing is right or not. And so that's fantastic. But once I started writing books, my very first book came out in 1999 about the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I started spending so much time on the other side of the notebook, people asking me questions. And then at, Dow Jones International Financing Review, I kept getting kicked upstairs into management positions. And I really kind of resented it when they made me take some of these management courses. But of course, now I appreciate how useful those are. And eventually I left, I went into the think tank world and again, got kicked upstairs. I had done a lot of groundbreaking work on sovereign debt crisis and there not being a bankruptcy code for countries. And so I learned to run an organization. I took over a think tank in New York right before Lehman Brothers went under, learned to fundraise in a really bad situation, really, grew really quickly, but sort of, eventually burned out and realized that I needed to be working on my own writing as well. And then of course, the Gray Rhino came out in 2016, and so many leaders in business, in policy, all over the place started to use the framework in the book and the ideas for taking a fresh look at obvious things. And so I really loved being able to use my ideas to help people behave better, make better decisions. And of course, early in your career as a journalist, they tell you, no, just write the story and let people figure it out from there. And I know now that what I write, what I think, what I say, how I interact with people can help them to make better decisions and to run their companies better, to run their countries better, to make better policies. And that really, really excites me.
So I want to bring it down to our daily lives, because you have so many examples. And why I say it was a page turner was because I saw all of these examples that you gave. New York City streets, other cities as well, but New York City streets, people get killed over and over again at the same intersection because of the traffic regulations, the cross signs, whatever it is. We do not have good traffic control or laws in place. You cite nearly 77,000 bridges that are structurally deficient. Makes me scared to go across any of our bridges in New York. Or the decisions, where sometimes we don't evacuate when a hurricane is coming or a flood or a fire or whatever. So all of these examples, which can be in our daily lives, how do you distinguish the gray rhino from black swans? What's the distinction? What's the description?
As you know, the black swan came out during the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009 as the thing that was unforeseeable, unpredictable, unimaginable. You can only see behind you. And it was meant as a way to encourage people to realize that they have to deal with uncertainty and give them a way to move through it. But of course, people abused it, they misused it, instead as a cop-out to basically describe any event where people didn't pay attention as, oh, black swan, nobody could have seen it coming. I mean, even Alan Greenspan called the great financial crisis something nobody could have seen coming. I had an apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I bought it in late 2000, and in 4 years, it had nearly doubled in value. And it was the first apartment, so I sold it. And, it was obvious to me that if something doubles in value in 4 years, this is not going to keep going. That's like really obvious, right? And, lots of stuff in the news, Christine Lagarde talking about a financial tsunami coming, which, a couple of weeks ago, we heard Jamie Dimon and using other, weather and water metaphors. So that's the black swan. And you hear a lot of people saying, oh, what's the next black swan? I'm like, okay, well, that's exactly what the concept is not about. So the gray rhino is the thing you can see in front of you. It's coming at you. It's obvious. It's big. It's impactful. It gives you a choice of what to do. So it's a response both to the black swan and then also to the elephant in the room, which is the kind of embarrassing, awkward thing that nobody talks about by definition. I mean, it normalizes the idea of nobody doing or saying anything. And the gray rhino is the thing that lots of people are talking about, that people are saying we need to do something about it, but all too often it doesn't get dealt with. So I meant it really as a challenge to get people to hold themselves accountable and to hold business and policy leaders accountable when they do see a gray rhino coming. And hopefully they're calling them out ahead of time, saying this is a gray rhino, deal with it now, instead of just looking back in hindsight and saying, ha, 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 I told you so, which is not how I meant the concept to be used.
Yeah, so in The Big Short, the movie and the book was about, there were indicators, the housing crisis, houses don't go up that quickly, right? And we also insured, the bond insurers insured packages of 2006, 2007 saying, well, if you pull them, they won't go belly up. Well, mortgages in those 2 years did go belly up. So there were some indications that we maybe closed our eyes to. Let's talk about, there's another one you talk about, 113-page disaster plan that the Louisiana state officials had on what to do should a Category 3 hurricane hit. This response plan, which I did not know, was in place January 2005, yet when Katrina did hit in August 2005, the plan did not go into effect. Why? And how should we respond when we face a gray rhino like that, which is sitting there looking us right in the eye? Do we charge towards it? Do we deny it? Do we freeze? It sounds like we denied this one.
Yeah, wait, a lot of people, the people with the power to make the decisions denied it. And, it's so common. There was a scenario exercise in 2019 about a pandemic that also didn't get put into place. We had experts focused on saving people from these things. And, a lot of times people look at political expediency instead of the right thing to do. They don't let the experts do their job. And there are lots of reasons why people deal or don't with a crisis, depending on sort of where you are, both the crisis itself and then, qualities inherent to a leader, to an organization, what their decision-making processes are, what their risk tolerance is, whether they're good at looking forward or whether they're looking so short-term that they might as well be looking backwards. So there's all sorts of different reasons, which I go into in the book and come up with a framework for analyzing where are you and your organization in dealing with this particular event, and where are the important stakeholders, the people who were affected by it and the people who can do something about it. And then what does it take to move those people from denial all the way to action?
Well, are the signals sometimes too weak, though? I mean, you're sort of like iffy, we're not sure, we shouldn't act, let's wait. Or is it really a built-in unwillingness or inertia or lack to act? Or, what really holds us back? I mean, we are human beings, so we see signals, but sometimes, the signal is not, it's not red, it's yellow.
Yeah, they're often confusing and conflicting signals. You've got to prioritize. And interestingly, I introduced the Gray Rhino concept at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2013. And I was actually invited to talk about weak signals. And I said, no, it's not necessarily the weak signals, it's the weak response mechanism, both getting the signals into the ears and the hands of the people who can do something with them, and then the motivation and the power of the people who can make the decision to do something about it. And I think in risk management in general, there's not enough focus on how we're responding and how we might respond better. Since 2008, you've seen all of these top risks lists. I mean, every year there's more and more. We're really good at making top risks lists, but in terms of responding, if you look at this year's World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, actually, there's a new feature on how do people judge the responses, the mitigation efforts to these. And I think that sort of measure, how well are our leaders doing, whether it's within a business or a country or other jurisdiction, how well are they doing in dealing with these gray rhinos, and how are we going to push them forward to do a better job?
In some cases, there's an issue about, I mentioned the inertia. And when you have people who, it's about like, you go too fast, people want the status quo. It's hard to move people ahead. They want to be part of the consensus. You're the unpopular voice or the naysayer, and you talk about this in the book. People don't want to hear that. They want to hear the positive, right? The movie always ends with a happy ending, right? So talk about a little bit in terms of, how people just reject that information that comes in because they want to be part. It's a little bit of groupthink too, that can happen in any boardroom, C-suite. Taking the unpopular stand is not always popular.
Well, absolutely. And it's why there's so much discussion these days about diversity on boards, which, as you know, brings diversity of perspective and thought. not just the, the boxes we tick on what category people belong to. And you need a diversity of opinions. And some of the research on groupthink says that the more similar people around a table are to each other, the more likely they are to just nod their heads as you go around the table and not ask the tough questions. And the other half of that is that coming up and saying the thing that nobody wants to hear is a big social risk. And some of the research shows, men and women in some ways are very similar in their risk preferences, but there are some areas where women or men will do more of different things. So men will, drive drunk. They're more likely to drive too fast, or, drugs or things like that. And women are more likely to take social risks, which is the risk of speaking up, saying the thing that nobody wants to hear, which is why women are so valuable on boards, because that thing that nobody wants to hear might be the big danger that's coming, or the big opportunity that we're going to miss, if we're too afraid of change. And the research shows that women are actually better at raising those sort of flags. So really, diversity of thought, awareness of your own decision-making strengths and weaknesses, of your own risk perceptions and appetite. And those are the people around you on a board in any decision-making team is so important to evaluating how well you're going to deal with the risks in front of you.
I've been in situations myself where it really, people don't want to hear bad news. They really just want to hear the good news, and they deny. And you're right, Professor Michael Page of the University of Michigan wrote a book, The Difference, and it talks about less skilled heterogeneous groups make better decisions than more skilled homogeneous groups. So to your point of what you're talking about, tell us about the organizations that you work with and how you advise them in planning for and responding to these gray rhinos.
I've been amazed by the variety, both geographically and by topic. There have been trade groups that I've worked with on everything from language travel to reskilling, to fintech, to all sorts of things, to policy groups, to education of first responders, and to all kinds of industries. I actually did something for a custom boat company last year, whose CEO wrote a really wonderful piece about his gray rhinos. And the great thing about this concept is that it is so flexible. And I really enjoy not just talking about the things that I'm good at, like, I love the big global macro strategy stuff, which I in before times, I used to talk about a lot in China, Korea, Singapore, and Europe, and will again as travel goes back to normal. But that this framework really applies to these 30,000 foot things, to specific problems that companies have. And it can even be applied to the mundane things, the seemingly mundane things like, succession. It's used a lot in digital disruption. I've seen, there have been thousands of articles around the world talking about it, applying it to all sorts of contexts, to the need for reform in education, to food security, to all kinds of things. And I really love that. And I love the way it's pushed me to learn about industries and areas that aren't necessarily my comfort zone, but that are so interesting. Like I learned a lot at a talk last fall about air logistics. I mean, just amazing applications.
So looking at some of and we have a question from the audience. One is, and it ties into something else that we have here. Would you call cyber risk gray rhino or Putin's expansion ambitions?
Yes and yes. I've been on a bunch of cyber security podcasts, and if you like, I'll share the links with you so you can share with the audience. And the Putin thing is interesting. I get asked a lot about that these days for obvious reasons. And I remember in 2014 talking to a leader of a Baltic nation. And this was right when I was really working on the concept. I was in the book, and I was asking her about any gray rhinos that she'd seen. And she said, and this was actually right after the Sochi Olympics and some of Russia's adventures that happened at that time. And she said, yeah, why do you think we joined NATO so quickly? So certainly a lot of people were looking back then. And then more recently, obviously not everybody thought that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. You know, the Ukrainians themselves didn't actually believe it was going to happen until it happened. But, you know, we now know that for months and months ahead of time, US and British intelligence had been briefing policymakers that there were even efforts to dissuade Putin. And you know, it's funny, I get a little uncomfortable with some of these things because people ask me, okay, was that a black swan or gray rhino? And they're looking in the past, and I try to push the concept forward. I mean, past is great as an example, but, you know, I look now at all the potential economic consequences, some of which we're seeing already with the food security and energy prices and things like that. You know, but also the threats that Putin has made to Finland, to Sweden. They're now mad at Lithuania. You know, Moldova has a lot of concerns. And given the things that he has said, given the actions, I think that the West would be very, very silly not to take that seriously. That is a big gray rhino right in front of us.
And so how do you advise people in terms of managing that which we see in front of us, but again, a timing issue, and how do we get some consensus or get others to see the rhino snorting at us? How do you do that as a leader? I mean, leaders today are really in very precarious positions, boards, CEOs, the C-suite. I mean, I think today's roles of running organizations and governments has never been more difficult. So how do you advise them, again, working with your clients, when you see this animal in front of you, he's spotted you, he's coming towards you?
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of elements. And one of them, within your company is, making sure you've got the communication channels. There's so many companies where all the frontline workers know what the problems are, but there's a disconnect all the way up to the C-suite. So the first thing is make sure that you are hearing the people in your company who are saying, hey, we need to pay attention to this. But the second thing is, when the board is aware of the problem, it's really about, a couple questions. First is there are often many competing gray rhinos at the same time. And it's absolutely beautiful that the word for a group of gray rhinos is a crash. I mean, one of those times when you just really love the English language. But sometimes you've got to prioritize, what's my gray rhino? What's the biggest one? How are they related to the other ones? Can I solve this one without also solving another one? If I solve this, will this help with another set of problems and actually create a bunch of stakeholders to support what I'm doing? Once you've got that, what's my gray rhino question answered, then you ask yourself, okay, who's affected by this? Who's got the power to do something about this? Who do I need on my side and where are they? So I've got a 5-stage framework, nod to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, starting with denial, muddling, diagnosing, panic, and action. Where are the stakeholders in this 5-stage, not always linear, but often linear progression? And what does it take to get them from the earlier stages to the action stages? And also spending a lot of time in the diagnosing stage where you're figuring out, okay, what does it take to solve the problem? What are the resources that I need? Who do we need to get on board? What are the communications? Whose mind do we need to change? So it's a real analytical framework for the obvious things in front of you. And I think the key is also just to remind yourself that we are so vulnerable to obvious things because they're obvious. I grew up in the Midwest and Texas, where it's really hard not to live within earshot of a train. And when you first move someplace, you hear that train all the time, or here in Chicago, if you live anywhere close to the L, but you just start tuning it out at some point. And that's a defense mechanism. But if you tune it out too much, then it becomes quite dangerous. And so getting people to just constantly remind themselves to take a fresh look at the obvious thing, to make sure that you're dealing with the thing in front of you, to be brutally honest about how well you're doing and what else you need to do to improve it.
So there's a question here from the audience. Do you have any examples of companies or boards seeing cultural toxicity as a gray rhino.
Oh, that's a really interesting.
Yeah, and so it's sort of like, should boards be really doing this screening of the culture on a regular basis and raising these issues? You know, is this part of what they need to be doing on their agenda?
Absolutely. And it goes down to risk culture, which is a lot of what the newer book deals with. You know, what's the organizational culture involving risk, whether it's the risks themselves or the systems you have set up for dealing with them. I mean, we're seeing in the news a lot lately, you know, Tesla's issues. Some of the social issues are part of why they got kicked off of ESG lists. You know, there's so many examples in the news. I don't want to call out anybody, you know, offending them, but it's so easy to find. And, you know, particularly with gender and other demographic minority groups, we see it over and over and over again. And it's the kind of thing that doesn't just hurt the person who's involved, but also the company. It's interesting. There've been a couple debates in social media lately about books. A lot of the business books that people read are written by men and not enough by women. And there was this huge thread recently, and a bunch of guys said, well, you know, I just care about the good ideas, not about the gender. And, you know, kind of implying that, you know, the good ideas are all the male authors. And I was like, well, if you want to get the good ideas, you've got to look at the people who aren't necessarily being put in front of you, who are the people who are the usual suspects, you know, that you are missing out if you don't stretch a little bit farther to listen to what people have to say, even if they're not part of the old boys network.
You make a big point of this in the book, and you know, I so enjoyed hearing this, is that, you know, you do need to listen to the front line. You do need to listen to the voices that are saying things that maybe you don't want to hear, right? And when we look back in times at different companies, the whistleblowers, a lot of them were women, you know, so you really have to be attuned to those voices in your company or your organization. And it's hard to do that. So what mechanisms, controls, operations, how do you manage some of these risks better than what we've been doing?
I think a really good place to start is your decision-making process. And that includes your risk culture at your organization. How do people deal with risks? In the new book, I talk about something called the Risk Fingerprint, which is the combination of your innate personality with your experiences, and not everybody's experiences affect them the same way. You know, one person might cut their finger with a knife and they never want to see a knife again. And someone else is like, oh, cut my finger with a knife, I survived, no big deal. And they keep, you know, those are like the entrepreneurs who fail and go on again until they succeed. And then the third part is really where I spend a lot of time with people. Those are the things that you can control. It starts with self-awareness of how you perceive risks. You know, how's your personality set? How have your experiences affected the way you respond to different risks? And then how do you optimize your habits, your peer group, your processes, the kind of company where you work, and then even your environment, you know, the things like the temperature, the color of the room, the fragrance you're smelling, what you eat for lunch. A big surprise to me was that if you have spicy food for lunch for a few hours afterwards, you're going to be more risk seeking. So that's the individuals. And then each company has a different set of individuals. People with certain kinds of personalities tend to gravitate towards certain careers. And like, for example, you'll see a lot of similar risk personalities among litigators and among contract lawyers, very, very different sets. And so when you're talking about diversity in decision-making, you want to look at how people deal with risk. Are they the people who pay attention to it? Are they the people who are shrinking violets, or do they always leap before they look? And do you have a good mix in the room, whether it's a board or a strategy team or across the whole company? That is very important in mergers and acquisitions. You see some of these legacy banks, you know, buying fintech companies, which have very different risk cultures. And I think being able to be aware of people's risk fingerprints and the organizational risk fingerprint helps you when you're hiring, when you're having conversations. Often there'll be what seems like an impasse, but when you talk about where people are coming from different risk perspectives, how long to leave to get to the airport on a business trip when you're sharing the taxi. Those can help to move conversations forward. So it's the combination of the self-awareness of the organization and the people in it, and then also an awareness of the Gray Rhino questions I mentioned a little while ago, that, what are the dynamics of the problem and how can you move it forward?
Now, you do talk about this risk fingerprint. So for me, doing executive search at the highest levels and for the boardroom, how does somebody like me really help a CEO or a board think about that next leader from that risk fingerprint? And like you said, not fingerprints shouldn't be all the same, but you need to have a good balance. So this is a concept to me that one should maybe put in play for selecting the next leader.
Absolutely, particularly because so many boards have been adding risk committees since the great financial crisis. The percentage has been going up quite a bit. Part of it involves certainly have that conversation about risk. One of my favorite questions is, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? Mm-hmm. And that's actually led to, what's the biggest risk you've ever not taken? Because a bunch of journalists come back to me and say, okay, smarty pants, Michelle, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And I explained a time in my life where I was balancing, health and career, thinking about it as a binary thing, and actually realized that if I didn't take care of the health, then there was no point in worrying about the career. And I realized that, the decision to leave my first Wall Street job and write my first book was actually the smaller of the two risks in front of me. So the second question is, what's the biggest risk you haven't taken? It's an amazing, amazing conversation. The other part is to not make assumptions and be aware of how common risk stereotyping is, particularly when you're dealing with gender. It's a huge thing with women. I talk to so many professional women who say, oh, I'm really risk averse. Then they tell me about their lives and I look at the risks they've taken. I'm like, huh? You think you're risk averse? And I've actually started to call it the risk A word and avoid it. And it's really more a combination of risk awareness and risk savvy, because not all risks are the same objectively. I mean, I'm 5'3.5". If I walk down an alley at 3 a.m., it's really different from a 6 foot something tall, however many pounds linebacker walking down the same alley. In business, it's the same for women. If a woman makes a misstep in business, she's actually going to be punished more than a man who makes the same misstep. Tons of research about this. But there's also research that shows that VCs are, you've seen the numbers about what a small percentage of venture capital goes to women's startups. Research shows that women's startups are actually more likely to be in business. They're more likely to succeed. And that when you look at measures, traditional financial measures of risk, there's actually not that big a difference between men and women. So it's that the women are taking better risks. And so you look in promotions, you look at companies being funded. I talked to one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in Chicago, who a couple years back had raised more money than anybody else. And she said in the early days of her company, she had to bring her now husband, at that time, co-founder and tech guru, into meetings with funders, because otherwise they think she, quote unquote, wouldn't take enough risks. So that goes to promotions within a company, to hires, to funding, to all sorts of levels. A lot of us are risk stereotyping when we don't even know about it.
So really being more aware, but you're right, the biases, the stereotypes just go so much into, and assumptions go into our decision making, but really delving into the risks people have taken or haven't taken, why they took them, really is an indicator of what type of decision making that leader is going to do down the road. And I think you explain this really well in the book. So another question from our audience: having been part of many enterprise risk management plans, it is always difficult to keep people focused on potential risks. Would an independent outside consultant be more effective in keeping people focused?
Great question, and yes and no. I mean, the keeping people focused on risks really has to be part of the culture. And there's one company in the UK that was starting a risk management program after a very serious outside event shock risk. And they were using the Gray Rhino concept in getting people to think about things, from phishing emails to other things. And the person who set it up told me that that people would see her going down the hall and they would call out and they say, I got a gray rhino for you. I got a gray rhino for you. And so that, you can't do that with an outside consultant. You really need the internal buy-in. That said, sometimes there will be risks that it's just too hard to see from the inside because you see them every day. I mean, when you're writing a book, you're not going to proofread it yourself because you've seen it so many times, you're not even going to see the mistakes. And so I think independent consultants have a very important role to play. And, particularly if there is any suspicion of somebody not doing what they're supposed to do within the company. It's that mix of inside and fresh independent perspectives that's important.
I think you're so right. Having been in corporate America before I was in search, I learned a lesson early on, and that was don't turn it all over to the outside consultant. You own the operations of that company and you own those risks. So you can get confirmation or, advice from, but don't turn the power over. You own that. And that's what you're saying. So we have another great question that comes from our audience. They say the comment on taking social risk and women generally being more apt to do this. Do you have any reference information for this as this person finds it fascinating and true?
There's a couple of really tedious academic studies that I would not wish on anybody, but there were a couple of really good books on this subject. One is Therese Houston's book on how women decide. And there's a chapter in there on women and risk, and Julie Nelson at University of Boston University on gender and risk taking. Those are really, really great. And particularly Julie Nelson's work debunks a lot of these headlines over the years of these studies that, where the headline is, oh, women are more risk, the word I don't say, right. But you look at the study and the statistical significance is so little, you need a magnifying glass to see it. Or she also looked at ranges versus averages, and that gives you a completely different picture of things. So I would say, don't read anything in the popular press because they're probably going to be taking a misleading study headline and making it even more misleading because it syncs with what they do. You'll see the same thing with millennials. Millennials risk averse. And I'm like, okay, well, if you've got $100,000 in student loans paying, I don't know what the interest rate is now, but, years and years ago, mine was like 7.5% or 8%, that by paying that off, you're automatically getting that return. And you're looking at a stock market, well, before a few weeks ago was at, crazy high levels and people still expect to go down. Well, what's the risk return on, a likely 8% a year return from paying down the loans or putting something into the stock market when you don't even have a rainy day fund? So it's really about risk awareness and risk savvy. And anytime anyone catches themselves saying risk averse, slap yourself on the wrist and think about why you shouldn't be saying it.
Right. So as we're entering a post-pandemic era, do you see individuals making riskier choices or avoiding risk, or is there a middle ground? Where do you see people today?
There have been some studies, I think The Economist did something looking at some of the past pandemics and how it changed behavior. We've, of course, all seen the headlines about the Great Resignation, record numbers of people switching jobs. And I read a story the other day saying if you've been at your job more than a year, you're probably being underpaid because the people they hired are getting paid more. But it's not so much about quote unquote riskier choices, because risk is not as objective as we like to think it is. It's about reordering your priorities. What's the risk of staying in a job where you're underpaid and the boss is abusive and you feel like you're not going to move ahead, even though you've got this nice 401k and health insurance plan and the job's going to be there? What over the long run is riskier? And you also see stories about during economic downturns, huge number of startups going up. Are people going back to school, making that investment? It's because the options have changed. People have reordered their priorities, and particularly with the pandemic, people have looked at mortality and they've said, what's really important? What do I really want to do with my life? Can I say that I am proud of what I'm doing? So it's not that they're taking riskier decisions. In fact, in a lot of cases, people think what they're doing is less risky. There have been some studies of freelancers, gig entrepreneurs, and they actually think that having several clients who they control is less risky than, quote unquote, working for the man and, having a mercurial boss control freak who can't make up their mind and being, your boss changes, you like them, and all of a sudden you're out. So it's a risk perception question. And I think it's really important that people are rethinking what's important, because the things you risk really tell the world who you are. They say what you're afraid to lose, what you're not going to lose, what your purpose is, what your goals are, your wishes, your desires, your fears, all of those are in your risk choices. I mean, and just like a fingerprint, it tells the world who you are.
Right. So are there some common perceptions or misconceptions about risk that you would cite?
Oh, absolutely. And we've talked about the risk A word and the, gender and, millennial misconceptions. But one of the things that has really struck me is how differently people talk about risk depending on where they are. The risk definition in classical economics is an uncertainty that you can assign a probability to, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but it's something you can assign a probability to, whether it's actuarial tables or pulling a number straight out of the air, but it's something you can reasonably guesstimate, the weather. And uncertainty is something where, who knows, the price of copper 100 years from now, you just can't predict that. And a lot of times people will assign a number to risk or a rating to risk as a way to feel control, even when that number is a lot squishier than people. Look at all those, the investment grade subprime mortgage derivatives, during the great financial crisis. And so I think people forget the subjectivity of risk. And I think that some of the risk professionals will talk about things in such quantitative terms, in such silos, that they forget that in everyday life, risk and uncertainty are intertwined. You can't separate them. And that's how people talk about it. And often when people say that they don't like to take risks, it's that they don't like uncertainty. And so actually being better at taking risks also means you become better at dealing with uncertainty. And there's not enough of a common vocabulary. And so you'll see in companies, a lot of the risk professionals tend to be stuck in silos, the business continuity people. And those are things that really everybody needs to be thinking of. And so they're kept separate when risk literacy really needs to be embedded throughout the organization.
Yeah, sometimes when you look at the P&C companies, they always do what if scenarios, correct? And they have to set up reserves for those. And there are some things that they just will not insure, right? So, I mean, that's the ultimate in terms of the risk that there will be a payout. Life insurance, I mean, all of those are risks. P&C, it's man-made or, natural disasters that are going to come. But it's those, sometimes the hidden things. And when we look at, or the unforeseen, maybe it's a black swan, maybe it's a gray rhino, but the climate change we've been dealing with for a long time, right? And we know what the levels of carbon should be, but we're not getting there. Or the Ukraine issue, or supply chain, or the pandemic, cybersecurity. So are these misses on our part, or are we just not doing enough what if scenarios as the P&C companies do? Or what's the answer on some of these things that are facing us today? And these problems look so huge. You talk about this in your book too. Like, how do I really have an impact? I'm an individual, or maybe all individuals in a company can do something. How does one deal with that? It's such a huge issue. And yet, do we boil it down to manageable issues?
There's a concept called learned helplessness, which is when you feel you don't have any influence over situation, you're just not going to do anything. And I think these big global problems can really feel like that. But people forget that, a beach is made out of a whole bunch of little tiny pieces of sand, and it wouldn't exist without every single one of those. With climate change, I think the big problem there is people who and organizations who benefit from the status quo. There have been public information campaigns really taking advantage of the fact that people don't want to hear about how hard climate change is. There's something else called solution aversion. If you don't like what you have to do, then you'll just pretend it's not there. And so I think there are people who are still profiting from fossil fuels, and a lot of those have so much influence over policy decisions. I think that's a very big part of it. But the last couple of years, I've been heartened that there's a change, not enough, but there are a lot more people speaking out, a lot more companies trying to change their behavior, and also a lot more recognition that there are huge opportunities, which I actually think are under-recognized, in clean tech, in efficiency, in, bringing some supply chains closer to home so that you're not creating as many emissions. I think there are huge opportunities in switching to renewables and clean tech. That's the kind of gray rhino that not enough people are seeing. And to the fossil fuel companies, the gray rhino is that people are going to switch over to those. And I think some fossil fuel companies have seen that. They're starting to talk some green talk and invest somewhat in some of those clean technologies, but it needs to happen a lot faster than it's happening right now.
So you cite in your book, another book, Max Razorman's, the 2014 book, The Power of Noticing What the Best Leaders See. Talk to us a little bit about what those best leaders see and how they react to your gray rhinos.
So interesting, because people are fascinated with seeing things or not. And I often get people try to talk to me about the gray rhino as if it's some, mysterious thing that maybe you can't see. And I'm like, it's a rhino. It's 2 tons. It's in front of you. It's stomping the ground, pawing the ground, and snorting is going to come at you. Like, if you're not seeing it, there's a problem. A lot of people will look away. But seeing the fact that we are so vulnerable to the obvious is I think, so central to this. When we started, when my literary agent started shopping around the gray rhino, in the first round, a bunch of editors said, well, why do we need a book to tell us to deal with obvious things? Because, well, they're obvious and we need to deal with them. So this is not counterintuitive. I don't get it. And I went, oh man, this is so counterintuitive. They don't even know it's counterintuitive. And so that's why, we changed the subtitle somewhat and really emphasize this, things are neglected. And it's been a little frustrating to me that I think we overcorrected, because a lot of people say, well, the gray rhinos are, just the obvious things that are neglected, when in reality, we neglect all obvious things, whether it's business, policy, or, the significant other that all your friends tell you you need to dump, or to stop eating cheeseburgers or whatever. And so for me, it's really about taking a fresh look at obvious things. But also, as Max Bazerman and others have said, looking in places that you're not necessarily looking for information. It's like you've probably seen the picture of the airplane from, I think, World War II, might have been another war, with the wings all riddled with bullets, and that, some planes went down, but the people weren't looking enough at the parts of the plane that weren't getting hit. And so, or, you look at, the Challenger disaster, which was, it hit me personally. I was a student at Rice at the time, and a lot of my classmates were involved with that. But you look at that, they were looking at the temperatures at which it failed, and they didn't look at the temperatures at which this O-ring succeeded. So I think in many cases, we're not looking at the right indicators. So that's certainly part of the equation. But for me, it's really this emotional connection with recognizing that it's not a cardinal sin if you don't naturally see what's obvious, but it's actually a real power if you recognize that you need to, from time to time, go back and take a new look at obvious things. So it's a rhino. It's not mysterious, but it's hard. Our brains are just weird, tricky things full of gremlins that play all sorts of nasty games on us.
Yeah, and if we don't challenge the status quo enough, we listen to the so-called expert around the table. We don't listen to the front line. We're not bringing in all of those opinions. So you talk a little bit about crowdsourcing opinions and how that can maybe help because you have multiple people speaking on what that gray rhino or that risk could be. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The research shows that in many cases, when you pull together, you aggregate a whole bunch of different opinions from all sorts of different angles, you're often more likely to get the right answer than if it's one person. The Wall Street Journal had the monkeys throwing darts at the dartboard that did better than the stock pickers. And there's the little game that some of you probably done at conferences where they give you a big bowl full of gumballs and they ask how many they are. No one person gets it, but if you average the answers of everybody in the room, you're going to get much closer to the right answer. And to me, that's really a metaphor for making sure you've got diverse voices coming in. Now, the challenge is how to do that in an efficient way, because often getting the input from the diverse voices can be slower, can be messier. But when you've got relationships, for example, on a board, you can start seeing things from your colleagues' eyes and understanding why they're coming from, where they're coming from. That can help you all together to move forward to, to the best answer that combines the diverse expertise. So it's fascinating. There've been all sorts of experiments. Google had the Google flu, where they were counting the number of searches for flu. And we're trying to use that to predict where we were going to get outbreaks. And then, of course, it wasn't always working as well as they thought. I was just talking with an economist recently who said, well, what if it's just that, when people are Googling flu, they're actually taking more precautions. And so they are reducing the likelihood that they're going to get the flu. It's similar to traffic patterns. A friend of mine who's a scientist who studies that has said, Waze and Google Maps and other things that say, hey, here's a traffic jam. There's a feedback loop that changes people's behaviors. And that's based on information from an uncountable number of sources. And so it's a really important place to look.
All the technological changes that are happening, the race to disrupt or be disrupted, what do leaders need to look for that may be lurking around the corner? And I just want to also throw in that Elon Musk has called AI our biggest existential threat that'll happen within 5 to a 10-year time frame. So is this another gray rhino that's out there threatening us with technological changes in AI? How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, when I was writing the book, I hadn't spent nearly as much time looking at that as I do now. I talked with Vivek Wadhwa about that, who wrote about some of the changes that technology was going to bring. And yes, it's going to bring a lot of changes. We don't know what all of them are. I mean, a few years ago, people were saying, oh, driverless cars are going to take away everybody's jobs. And now people are like, oh, the driverless cars aren't doing as well as we thought. Maybe that's going to take longer. People around the world have very different perceptions of this. There's a study in 2017, I believe, of about 300 AI experts in Asia and in the West. And they asked, when are we going to reach high-level machine intelligence, which is when machines can do things, just about everything better than humans. And the Westerners thought it would take about twice as long as the Asian respondents to that question. So there's a huge difference in risk perceptions. And even in AI, one of the things that fascinates me is the algorithms, how algorithms are created. And if you're talking about self-driving cars, different countries will program very different priorities into, if it's inevitable that there's going to be a crash, do you run over the granny or the lady with the stroller? And it's very different culturally. So there's a lot of reasons. I think there are a lot of social implications of tech that are where I concentrate a lot of my effort on. It's just something Kai-Fu Lee has written about very elegantly, about how a lot of these scalable tech companies are making huge profits with much less labor and much less capital, and it's skewing all sorts of things. And we're going to see social tensions as a result of that. So I think AI is not just one gray rhino, but it's, it's a crash of gray rhinos. Some of them are very blurry. They're still coming to focus. Some of them are a little bit further on the horizon, because gray rhinos can be, they can be near, they can be far, they can be fast, they can be slow, they can be connected to other ones or not. I've also seen in the news, there's one academic who described gray rhinos as slow moving by definition. And it's clear to me that this person had not really read the book. And other media started quoting this person. I said, no, so I've had to reach out to the media and say, no, this is, it can be any number of these things. And I think AI is like that. And it also depends on your perspective. I mean, you're for VC investing in it, it's one thing. It's the missing the opportunity. But if you're someone who needs to add the skills to be able to work effectively with it, that's something else. And if you're someone who's never going to get these skills, that's an entirely different beast.
You have a wonderful chart in the book. I think it's on page 13 or 131. And you talk about the different rhinos and how one can really prioritize what the risk can be. You want to describe that chart? Because it seems to me that a lot of people on this call who sit in boardrooms or in the C-suite or doing their jobs would gain a lot of knowledge, which would be practical in terms of a daily and how they're doing their jobs on how to manage risk, and it may be a sleeping rhino to a charging rhino to snorting rhino, whatever. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's, I really came up with this chart and very abbreviated strategies for each one, but it's basically around, how fast, how slow, how big, how small. And since the book came out, I found that people see some apparently very small things, the personal gray rhinos, which wasn't what I had originally been looking at, but they're not impactful in terms of society, but they're impactful for the person who's dealing with them. But how fast, how slow, how fast, how close, how far, how big, what other things are they related to, and which direction? Is there a clear solution? I was thinking at the time about Syria, where it was a bunch of least worst options. And so sometimes there's not a solution. There's sometimes when the solution is to actually let yourself get run over. If it's a product that's obsolete, the gray rhino is that you're missing the opportunity to go with the next thing, like Kodak and digital cameras, for example. So there are those, and the one I get asked the most about is actually about what I call the meta rhino, which is the sort of systemic factor, which might be the groupthink or gender or other DEI shortfalls that get in the way of decision making. I look at politics in the United States right now, for example, and you have this polarized society that that brings some of the most extreme candidates to the fore, and they're so far apart they can't get together to come up with agreements on what most Americans agree on. I mean, that's a huge decision-making meta gray rhino that affects, the economy, that affects society, affects stability, affects everything. It affects the world. And so I think that for a lot of companies asking themselves, what's the meta gray rhino? Is it that we, as a company, reward people sitting on their butts instead of, taking some risks? Do we allow constructive failure or not? Do we let people speak up and warn us about problems? There's some research I wrote about in Strategy and Business last year about there's a correlation between taking social risks and creativity, which in turn ties into innovation. So you really want that squeaky wheel who says, hey, why aren't we thinking about this? Because that person also is likely to be one of the more creative people who helps you to come up with the next big idea. So that meta rhino area is actually really fascinating. And you are what your risk goes into that a lot more, that sort of individual and group psychological, cultural, and processes that affect whether people deal with their gray rhinos or not.
You bring up so many good points. The book is just filled with examples of the risks that are out there. And it does come down to leadership. It does come down to, like you're saying, the culture in the organization and leaders listening, letting people speak up, having a culture where people feel safe to try, fail fast. All of these things that the fingerprint of risk taking, I think, is something that we all need to look at as we're selecting leaders. So Michelle, I cannot thank you enough for this book. I've read it. I'm going to actually read it again. It's scary in some parts because you see all these, as I said, all these huge issues, whether it be hunger, cybersecurity, bridges, your own personal, health, and which we're doing there. But you really put it to the forefront that the examples are so poignant and everything we see every single day. So thank you for writing this book. I'm going to make this a gift to many of my clients. I'm probably going to do fingerprinting for my candidates. So, any parting words? I know we're at the end of the session, but I just want to say any parting words, advice to others here on the audience.
Well, I think it's asking the questions, the what's your gray rhino? And what are you doing about it? And what do you need to do differently? And then on the other hand, what goes into your risk fingerprint? Why are you making the choices you are? What's the biggest risk you've ever taken? What's the biggest risk you've ever not taken? Are you happy with those results or not? And what would you do if you had to do them again in the future? And those questions alone are food for all sorts of reflection, thought, conversations. Ask them to your colleagues, to your clients, particularly for people in financial services. It's a great way to get to know your clients and help them better. But ask those risk questions. We make 35,000 plus or minus choices every day. Every one of those choices is a risk. Every risk is a choice, but we don't talk enough to just straight out about risk. And that's what I really want to change.
And challenging the status quo. Be a brave leader, have the courage, and watch what you eat at lunch. If it's spicy food, you may be making more riskier decisions. It's according to Michele. Michele Wucker, thank you so much. We're all buying your book and reading it. So thank you so much for joining us today, and to our audience as well. It's been a pleasure having you here today.
Thanks, Janice, and to everyone. This has been really fun.
Okay, and may everybody manage those gray rhinos so that your risks are intact in the coming year. Thank you all so very much.